put us on Facebook as well. So once the conversation is starting, I think it'll work by that time.
Okay, so recording is on.
Yeah, fine.
Bani, please unmute yourself.
Yes, done.
Good evening, everyone from Majha House, Amritsar. I would especially like to welcome our guests, the two people speaking today, Sandeep Raina, author of this wonderful new book on Kashmir, A Bit of Everything, and Bani Gill, who will engage him in a conversation this evening. It's bitterly cold with temperatures plummeting in the north of the country. That's all I can think of because my teeth are chattering. I'm horribly cold. It truly is a winter of discontent as we contemplate the year that has gone by. From November 2019 to December 2020, there has been no let in the almost apocalyptic sort of events that have besieged our country and the world. From the pandemic to the huge migrant crisis, from protests over the Citizen Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, to the present farmers protesting at the doors of Delhi, from earthquakes and forest fires to locust attacks and floods, we've experienced it all. And in the midst of it sits another very important, even contentious issue, Kashmir. The imposition of Article 370 a year back and the silencing of ordinary people's voices. I don't want to go into the politics of this debate, but I do want us to think about the human cost of years of living in uncertainty, in fear, under the shadow of a gun, whether a militant gun or that of the security forces. But I think, feels to them like an occupation of a very beautiful land, always known as a paradise on earth. Leaving one's homeland is never easy. It leaves indelible scars and traumas. It fills the soul with a loneliness difficult to dispel, however far one travels and whatever one's later life turns out to be. Sandeep Raina's book brings this angst to life. Loss, longing, making peace. For me, it meant seeing Kashmir and its beauty afresh through the eyes of somebody who's lived there, somebody who's grown up there, and in a sense has never left, for Kashmir lived and lives on in him and in his memory. His descriptions are so evocative and so immediate. Talking to Sandeep is Bani Gill, who has some years of experience working as an anthropologist and as an migrationist, I'm sorry. And she's lived and worked in Uganda and in Denmark among communities of the dispossessed and refugees. She's also worked with similar communities in Delhi. We can look forward to talking about themes of belonging, of home, nostalgia, of the immigrant experience, of being a refugee, of being Kashmiri Pandit, forced out of Kashmir, and so much more. Thank you, Sandeep, for giving us a sensitively written novel that encompasses all of these. And thank you, Bani, for agreeing to do this conversation in between your academic commitments. I read, I think maybe that was the first review that came out on the book by Tabish Khair the other day. And in his fine review, he says that the novel is driven by the need to confront, to record, and understand a never-ending tragedy. So over to you, Bani, and welcome everybody, and welcome audience who has come here expecting a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Preeti, and thanks for setting up the stage, as it were, the context of 2020 and the context in which we will be discussing this issue, and Sandeep Raina's wonderful work on writing this fiction novel based on Kashmir. Thanks to Majha House for hosting us and for inviting us. And thanks especially to Sandeep for writing such a delicately crafted and nuanced book about a land, a culture, and a people that have all too often been crassly compartmentalized and reduced to an issue, the Kashmir issue. Kashmir, as we all know, is very difficult to speak about, much less to write about, especially in these current times. The lines of divide are etched far too deep, the polarization of opinions far too cemented, and yet, within this politicized landscape of trauma and turmoil, Sandeep offers us a fine grained, sensitive, and empathetic account of individuals, families, communities, neighborhoods, streets, and places that are caught up in the crosshairs of what some may describe as militancy and radicalism, and others as settler colonialism. Now, Sandeep Raina's debut novel, A Bit of Everything, is a remarkable piece of work that places at the center of its narrative the lived experience of displacement and of forced migration. The main protagonist of the book is Rahul, a Kashmiri Pandit, a professor of literature, a resident of Barmul, and husband to Dura, the daughter of a local zamindar. And it's his story of exile from Kashmir. But this is a very powerful book that steers clear of posing any simplistic kinds of binaries of identity and instead forces one to think about loss of identity, of home, of land, and the ways in which the life of people is so intimately connected to the land that they live on, the land that they grew up in. So, Sandeep, I want to begin by asking you that this is your debut novel, and first books are, known to be somewhat autobiographical. So, I'm wondering how true that might be in your case, and how much of Sandeep and your life has gone into the making of Rahul.
Thanks, Buddy, for the beautiful words, for the book, for the writing. Thanks, Preeti, for giving me the opportunity for being on Majha House today, and thanks to everybody at Context in Westland to be able to have this conversation today. Bani, your question is how much of Rahul is actually derived from myself. My first book, so a lot of what has gone into the book, a lot I will say, is based on my own experiences, feelings. A lot of them are feelings, really, conversations and things that I observed while I was growing up in Kashmir and later, but it's not autobiographical. It's not me. Rahul is not me, certainly not.
What about the title of the book, A Bit of Everything? I mean, that's also remarkably evocative. So could you elaborate more for the audience who perhaps have not yet had the opportunity to read the book, that what does the title refer to? And in that way, is it also an autobiography or not an autobiography? Is it a bit of everything?
Yeah, that's really nicely put. Very often I say everything that we write is based on what we have seen, observed, and felt. So everything that has gone into the book, including its title, is based on that. So that does reflect a part of who I am as a writer, what my actual feelings are. A bit of everything is about inclusiveness, I think, being inclusive of all kinds of thoughts, all kinds of ideologies, all kinds of faiths and beliefs, and the ways of life that we all have. So I don't want to say more because I would let people read the book to find out more about that, but that's what it really pertains to.
That's really lovely. I really was quite taken in by the title. And the more that you read, the more it kind of unravels and makes sense that why you've chosen this A Bit of Everything. I want to actually go back to this review that Tavish Khair had written about your book, which Preeti mentioned earlier, which is, he says that you write with great passion, and it seems to us that this is more than just a novel that you're writing. You're trying to capture a moment in time. You're trying to understand, remember, document, make sure that memory still kind of lives on. And I'm wondering, was that a conscious kind of thought that you had when writing?
Yeah, I think impact to recall things is a very long exercise. You can go back many years in time and recollect things in a way that, for me personally, a lot of things come back with a lot of positive flavor to them, and that's how I guess there's a defense mechanism in everybody's mind which kicks in when you recollect the past. Yes, of course, there are memories which are not as pleasant or as great, but I think there is this innate mechanism within the human body to filter out and keep some of those negative things out. And most of the stuff that comes out lends a positive hue to it. So we end up remembering things more positively, whether it's our childhood memories, whether it's the moments we spent with our friends in our hometowns, places that we grew up in. Of course, there are little bits of it's peppered with small incidents and things. But yes, it was a conscious decision to recall and write from my own memory and of incidents that had happened while I was growing up.
This nostalgia of memory that you almost speak of, that really comes out in the book. And it also comes out in the context of the home that Rahul has painstakingly built in Barmul. This home comes alive in the novel through this thick description of its layout, its beautiful gardens, the decor, in its intimate rituals, inside the home. Now, in the book, you deftly connect this loss of the physical home with a figurative losing of home. And perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on this theme about how one defines home in a physical as well as figurative or symbolic way, and the interconnections between this physical, tangible home of brick and cement and concrete, and the larger home that represents, a sense of community and belonging.
Yes, both are homes. The physical is the house, the brick and mortar, as you say, and the doors and the windows and the rooms that you grew up in, the rooms where you had your books and clothes and things. That's all builds into your memory of a house or a home. But within that house, you also have conversations. You have the memories of your parents and your brothers and sisters and friends who visit you. So it's not just the brick and stones, it's also within the house, the environment that you had, the food that you ate, and it's the memories and the recollection of all those memories, which is what one calls home. Beyond that physical home is the culture within which you reside, the environment in which you absorb the song and the dance of a place, to put it that way, the language of a place. So when you lose both, when you lose your physical home, of course you lost that environment in which you grew up and the food and things. That's one loss. That's the physical part. But the larger loss, I think, is when you lose a lot of the other things around you, the culture, the language, the sense of belonging to a piece of land. The trees and the mountains and the snow and the rivers, they also become part of what you call home. And I think it's true for anybody in the world, especially for those parts where you have spent your childhood. Less about your adulthood, I think your formative years, where these memories kind of stick in your head and they become part of you. That I don't think it ever leaves you.
Absolutely. And I think in the book you explore that, those memories of home and Rahul's need to kind of recreate home in all the different places that he visits thereafter. So in this, continuing on this theme of home and homing, Rahul in the book is forced to leave the valley and then go to Delhi, then Austria, and finally the UK. Now, for refugees like Rahul, where is home? Where does home really lie? In the novel, you explore some micro practices of homing in a way, the ways in which, as you just spoke, the ways in which one tries to build a sense of home through the food one eats, the clothes one wears, the language that one thinks and feels in rather than just speaks in. So I thought that the relationship that Rahul develops with Mo, the tea vendor over cups of sheet chai in London, was particularly evocative. So could you tell us more about the ways in which Rahul seeks to create home in distant lands, in Delhi or London or elsewhere?
So Rahul has, as a character, is once forced out of Kashmir under the circumstances of the early 90s, and then he chooses to leave Delhi. So there are two migrations he has in a way. One is kind of forced, the other he brings on himself, because he chooses to leave Delhi and go out of India in that sense, or out of Delhi actually. So So there is no loss of Delhi in his head. The loss is more of Kashmir, which is very interesting to note, because when people make a deliberate choice or willingly leave their homelands, they tend to defend that position, or they tend to defend that migration. Whereas when you are forced to leave because of whatever circumstances there are, that you never reconcile with. A lot of people never reconcile with that. So the home tends to be more of the place, or the memories tend to stick more of the place where you have been forced to leave. The choice was not yours. And therefore, what Rahul as a character remembers is more of Kashmir than he remembers of the time he spent in Delhi. And he tends to remember, of course, in his character, he tends to remember the house. He was very attached to the house. He's very attached to his surroundings, his garden. And later on, the connections he tries to build are through language, through the taste, the smell, the flavors of Kashmir, which he finds in London, or tries to find in London after a very, very long time. So it's basically his nostalgia kicks in, I think, a little more when he's so far away, removed from that environment, and the feeling of loneliness kicks in, and he derives some satisfaction in connecting with people who either are eating the same food, or are talking the same language, or looking the same, perhaps.
Yeah, I completely understand what you're trying to say. Perhaps you should also think about, I mean, this idea of choice that you bring up, it's choice is also, what does choice mean for people who don't really have that much choice to move in the first place? So of course, I think you make a strong point when you say that Rahul kind of chose to leave Delhi and go to the UK. But that choice is also under a lot of stress and pressure, because this is obviously not a choice he had made to even come to Delhi. So leaving Delhi, I mean, it muddles up our entire idea of what choice might be for people who have limited resources at a particular time and place. And then I think it's also interesting that you mentioned that where does home really lie? Because for Rahul, he's able to recreate that sense of home, maybe because of the weather in a London. He's able to recreate bits of Kashmir in London, but he's not able to recreate bits of Kashmir in Delhi. So that's also an interesting kind of layer that you bring about that. Is it really nation states that define what home is, or is home much more in, as you said, is it in the smells, in the taste that we have, and so on? Another central theme, I think, the home and homing is a wonderful exploration into these themes in your book. Another very strong theme that you describe is that of identity. And here I want to ask you, who is Rahul? What categories of belonging does he ascribe to, or is he forced to ascribe to at different points in his time, in his life? Is he a Hindu? Is he a Kashmiri? Is he a Kashmiri Pandit? Is he a Varmuli? Or is he a brown male body in the context of a London, Or is he a bit of everything? How do you think of identity in terms of your characters in novel?
I think for so when you're growing up in a small place, let's say you're growing up in Kashmir, let's say Rahul lived in Kashmir, he grew up there, he became an adult there. There's no concept of identity in smaller places. I think you just are who you are, and you're accepted as you are. It's only when you move to larger cities, whether it's within India or within a city like Delhi or Cairo or London or New York, that you suddenly are confronted with the concept of identity. But now you're being seen from a very different angle altogether, that this is a person having come from India or from Kashmir. He speaks Kashmiri, so he must be Kashmiri in identity. And he follows the Hindu religion, so he must be Hindu by identity. But in reality, do we really focus so much on these things when we're growing up or in our family? Yes, of course, we belong to a set of values or a faith or a language or cultural system. I don't think there's a lot of emphasis in homes to kind of, stress on those things. It's only becoming more and more apparent and more visible when you're away from those places, especially in larger cosmopolitan places.
May I request that the audience please mute themselves?
So I think the thoughts of identity, as it might happen to anybody living out of their homeland or their native land, comes over a period of time, and sometimes you're very confused with who you are, because it depends on the person who's trying to put you into a bracket or a box, and they may call you, oh well, you come from Kashmir, so you are a Kashmiri, right? Of course. And then you're moving out of India and you invest in Germany, and the Germans will say, oh, you're Indian. Yes, of course, that's also right. And then they say, let's say you go to a group of Pakistanis who are, let's say, Muslims, and they'll say, so you're a Hindu and you're a Pandit, because that's the first thing they will observe about you, perhaps. You know, what I'm saying is, this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens very often when people will first see you for your differences. And that's kind of becomes your temporary identity for that moment. You know, in that group, yes, you become a Pandit. In a different group, you become an Indian. In another group, you might become a Kashmiri. So I would say there's no one identity. These are multiple identities we carry within ourselves. And it would be very foolish and very short-sighted to typify yourself as just one kind of person, as a Hindu or a Sikh or a Christian only, or just a Kashmiri or a Varmuli. And you know, I mean, of course, there are these identities. When I moved from Baramulla to Srinagar to do my higher education, suddenly I became more prominent as a person from Baramulla, because the majority of people were from Srinagar. And that was a massive, big differentiation that was made suddenly, which had never occurred to me. When I moved from Kashmir to Delhi, suddenly I became Kashmiri, and this had never occurred to me. That was really, is that my only identity? But this happens, and I think one needs to accept it, and one needs to add them as layers to your personality, and they just add such beautiful dimensions to who you are. Nothing wrong with that. I would not stick to just one.
I think that's a great thought. I mean, too often identity becomes with a capital I, and it's supposed to define all parts and aspects of you. But in reality, identity is very relative, it's very relational, it's very situational. It depends on who's asking, and it depends on who's asking at what point in time as well. And too often we kind of gloss over these nuances, which actually in your book, you really highlight the nuances between these binaries of identity that we're given with. And this thing that you say about, layering of identity, I think that's extremely important. I mean, to think of identity in hyphenated terms, we can be many things, you can, and in your book, you mentioned this one identity, or this hyphenated identity that I found really interesting, which is that of the Muslim Brahmin, and is that something that you came up with, or was it, how did you conceptualize of that?
I heard that being said. Heard it being said, and by somebody who knew, he said that this is what we used to call the Kashmiri Pandits, and this was from mainland India, from northern India. And he said just matter of factly that this is how we identified or understood the Kashmiri Pandits, that they are Muslim Pandits or Muslim Brahmin. So, which was, I don't know with what intention it was being said, but I thought it was a wonderful statement, actually. It was, it just put so many things together, right? That here are Pandits who eat meat as part of their culture, which doesn't happen very often with a lot of Pandits or Brahmins in India, or within the Hindus. And then here is this Pandit community, which is culturally very close, or rather a replica of the Kashmiri Muslims in terms of their culture, their dress, their food, their language, and the way they look and feel, and the way they talk. There's no difference. And except for what you do at home, whether you ring a bell or you do the namaz, that's perhaps the only difference. So these are wonderful coinings, I would say. These should be encouraged rather than looked down upon or frowned upon, because I think I would say, why just one hyphen? Put multiple hyphens there, right? So Muslim, Pandit, Kashmiri, Delhiite, English, British, whatever you want to make the chain as long as you can. Why not?
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And in the book, you also, kind of reflect on how identity is so closely linked to language, and it's a question of perspective. Which side of the border, so to speak, are you really looking from? And I think we have this wonderful excerpt that perhaps you'd like to read out for us, which really encapsulates, this multi-perspective link view on identity. Perhaps you'd like to read some of that for us.
Okay, is this the one that we talk about the Jammu Kashmir Punjab border kind of?
I thought maybe the other one, but if you would like to do that, that's
also. I can do the other one. I can do the other one. Mm-hmm. This is when Rahul happens to be in London on Oxford Street. So I'll start from the point where he's sitting on Oxford Street on a bench, and then he observes something. A little girl, about 6 or 7, ran up to him and looked at him with her large brown eyes. He remembered Raju with a pang. It was how old he was when they had left Kashmir. Now, a teenager in Delhi, he had become difficult to talk to. Rahul smiled at the girl and patted her on the head. An Asian woman in a bright shalwar kameez came out of the store, shopping bags hanging on both her wrists, and called out loudly, Bilkis, andar aa jao, bahar barish ho rahi hai. Come back in, it's raining. As she took her daughter's hand, Rahul asked her, Indian? Pakistani, came the reply. You spoke to your daughter in Hindi, so I thought you were Indian, said Rahul, not knowing what else to say. That was Urdu. Had I spoken Hindi, I would have been Indian, but I spoke Urdu. Oh, sorry, said Rahul. He wanted to tell the woman that the two languages were not too different, that a few words borrowed from Sanskrit in one and Persian in the other could not make them all that distinct. But why bother? He wondered when he would find someone who would be Urdu speaking and Indian, or Hindi speaking and Pakistani, or perhaps Hindi Urdu speaking and Indian Pakistani, like a Kashmiri. Kashmir sat between the two countries, after all. This is what the Muslims in Varmul had insisted. For the Pandits, Kashmir was Indian, or this is what the Muslims had suspected. Bye, said the Pakistani woman politely. Khuda Hafiz, said Rahul. When the woman turned back to look at him, he smiled and said, that was Urdu.
That's really wonderful. It kind of makes us think about how close and intimate these languages and these cultures are, and we've just kind of artificially imposed these borders between us. Now that we are talking a bit about Varmul in particular, I love the description of Varmul in the book. The town is described through moments of intimacy, of kinship, and the close relations between the neighbors, especially on Tashkent Street, who come together in good times and bad. Now, the beauty of the trope of the small town is explored in contrast to the sullen ugliness of Delhi, really. And perhaps you could tell us a bit more about this contrast, between the intimacy of Varmul and the enforced cosmopolitanism, as you just said, almost, in a place like Delhi. And also, is there a street called Tashkent Street? Because it's such an evocative name with such a rich history. So.
Okay, so the first question, no, there is no street that I know of called Tashkent Street in Baramulla, but there is a square called Tashkent Chowk. And from friends tell me it still exists, and it still is called Tashkent Chowk. It is in Baramulla, yes. To compare a place like Kashmir to a place like Delhi, one could do many comparisons there. I mean, they're so different as places. And when I say Kashmir, I mean the towns of Kashmir, the smaller places within Kashmir. Kashmir has a city and it has many towns and villages as well. The culture is different, the language is different. And when you're growing up in a small, secluded place like Kashmir, which when I say secluded, because for many months in the winters, the only connection of Kashmir to civilization would get cut off for weeks and months. So you're really in a kind of very closed culture where not a lot of people have come over time. Yes, over centuries, there might have been migrations, but it's not a place where there were even railways, right? So there was no trains coming in and going out of Kashmir. So the culture was very preserved, whether it was for Kashmiri Pandits or Muslims, or the Sikhs for that matter. Um, so what you call as a composite Kashmiri culture, right? With little influence of, other than the television that we used to watch and the books that we used to read, of rest of the world, I would say. This is at least what I think when I was growing up. Delhi, on the other hand, I see it as a totally open place. It is kind of borderless as a city, and that is true of all big cosmopolitan metropolitan cities. They're kind of borderless. They're not cocooned, and they're open to any voice. They're open to anybody. And that's the positive side of a big city. It allows anybody to come and it allows anybody to go out. It will not point out your cultural, it will perhaps assimilate a lot of that, what I call as boiling in Delhi, because you ultimately simmer and boil and you become sort of a homogeneous Delhiite, which I also personally became for 10 years. And I used to call myself a Delhiite because a lot of people, perhaps Bani, you grew up in Delhi as well. You identify yourself as a Delhiite, not as a Bengali or a Punjabi or a Tamil. But Delhi, on the other hand, also because of the rush and the material world that it is immersed in, the desire to earn more money and the desire to build more, look better, dress better. I mean, there's a different culture in these cities which thrives, which brings in, economic prosperity, but little time left for many, many things. And that's where the ugly part starts becoming more visible. When the time left for the slower human things, which I think are more available in a place like Kashmir, that's where my comparison, I wouldn't call it sullen and ugly necessarily, but it's a beautiful city with beautiful history behind it. I also like Delhi a lot. But it's not just about Delhi of what I think of, it's the character who is in a very sad frame of mind, has been forced to leave his homeland, has landed up in a big city like Delhi and finds it extremely alien, because it's your state of mind as well. It would not be the state of mind of a child who has grown up in Delhi. They would love Delhi as Rahul loves Kashmir. I would say it could happen also to a person from Delhi landing up in Kashmir and feeling, I remember there were people in our family who had never lived in Kashmir and were forced through marriage to come to live in, aunts who were forced to come and live in Kashmir. They used to be depressed by the weather. They used to feel very, very sad. And they said, this is a very repressive, so these are things that happen to you because you come into a new place and your first reaction is, I don't like this place, because you want to connect it back to where you came from. And it's only when you spend a very long time in those places that you get used to them. But so, yeah, I don't know whether that answers your question about, no, Delhi is not sullen and it's not ugly. But to Rahul, because of what he's undergoing, it does appear so.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I don't think we should essentialize any city as sullen and ugly, but I think it gives us an insight into the mind of the protagonist, as he's kind of describing the suffocation and the heat. And the heat is both kind of course, the weather and so on, but it's also a metaphorical heat, the heat of life, of having to constantly be at it, the grind that you describe, which really comes out in Delhi because it's such a marked distinction or change from what he was used to in Kashmir, So I think it's absolutely, as you say, it's much more reflective of the character and the place that he finds himself in rather than the place in and by itself. I want to talk a little bit more about this, the sense of what it means to actually be a refugee. Just the term refugee has become such a politicized kind of identity, and not just in India, of course, but all over the world, in Europe and so on as well, right? Like refugees, migrants have kind of become this stigmatized group. But I wanted to kind of ask you, what is the experience of forced displacement and of being a refugee in one's own country, which has suddenly, become distant and foreign? And I also want to take it one step further by asking that do you think we're in dangers of recreating such a marginalized space in light of recent legislation? And are there, in fact, some similarities to be drawn between the refugee experience of the Pandit community and other refugee experiences? And maybe that should be the basis of a solidarity movement rather than even more fracturing as we're experiencing today.
Yeah, I think good point. I think every experience should teach us. Every experience, good or bad, should teach us, and that should be recorded, and that should be learned from, and not to be repeated if it's a negative one. And that's the whole point of recording history, of any wrongs that have happened in society, of people having done them to other people, or the governments, or the kings and the sultans of the world who might have made mistakes in governing. They should be recorded so that they do not get repeated. So if there has been suffering, or there has been an unfortunate event like the exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits from Kashmir, which I think was quite unexpected, but it happened, and it is right there staring us in our face, and there's been no resolution to it. There's been no going back. And what triggered it, what caused it, what were the parties involved in actually bringing it into that unfortunate event as it happened, and continues to happen, I would say, because there's not been no resolution, should be something that we need to perhaps analyze at various levels, at societal levels, at personal levels, at governmental levels. And the debate should be had, because if you shy away from the debate, it's a reality. And if that reality cannot be confronted, cannot be questioned, cannot be analyzed, then you're bound to repeat it. If you're not learning from it, you will repeat it. And you'll repeat it to another group now. And you'll fracture, as you said very rightly, you'll fracture your society into these smaller pieces, because now what was a Pandit group before as a minority in a largely Muslim Kashmir, there may be a Sikh minority, or there may be a Christian minority, or there may be a Dalit minority, or a Muslim minority in India, or any part of the world. So you have to understand that it's, yes, to your first question, how was it to be a refugee in your own country? No different from a refugee who might have come from Pakistan in 1947. I would say there was apps for me, my family, for people I knew who had migrated or fled. It was no different, because the stories and anguish and the fear and the level of threat was perhaps, if not in the same magnitude, but the feelings were exactly the same. So whether you were called a refugee or not, whether you called a migrant, that doesn't matter, because what matters is what this person has undergone. And that is real, and that has to be recognized, and that has to be acknowledged, because many times these things don't get acknowledged, and they remain like a sore, and they get brushed off because of politics of the times. So I would say if that's a reality, then we must also remember or acknowledge other realities as they are unrolling right in front of us today in contemporary India or in other parts of the world. And they are there, and these are not, these are not fiction. I see them in Europe, I see them in Britain, I see them in India. These things can happen. And once you have undergone these experiences yourself, you're more conscious. You pick up on the smaller comments, and you pick up on the exchange of messages or the kind of tone and language that is being used. And it suddenly hits you, and you say, oh my God, this is happening again. But this time, perhaps I'm not the victim, somebody else is a victim. And it's not too different. And my role as somebody who understands it far earlier than anybody else should be to step up and stop that from happening. Because if I could not stop it from happening for myself, at least let me try and save somebody else from the torture, from that problem, because it's building up, and you can see it building up.
Absolutely, Sandeep. I think this is such a strong point that you make to learn from what has happened in history, and to make sure it doesn't repeat. And perhaps the biggest lesson we can draw is that of empathy, that we can all relate to each other at a very human level. We've seen it, we've experienced it, and perhaps we can prevent it from happening again.
Yes.
And this, you really explore this in the novel. And there's also kind of of course, everybody's aware of the fraught politics in Kashmir and the hardening of identities and, the kind of essentialization of human beings to a particular category of being. And in your work, what I find interesting is that there are these points of subversion almost, right? You're constantly trying to upturn common sense understandings, kind of deconstruct, messy up these binaries and so on. And one way that you do that is through the love story between the Kashmiri Pandit and the Muslim man. And it's a strong exploration of love and of the power of love across identities. And how central was this theme of love, of solidarity, of empathy to the making and the inspiration of the book?
I think love makes the world go round. I think there's no other force which makes the world, this funny world, go round. That's the only force which keeps it together. Nothing else. No level of intelligence keeps it together. No level of power or politics will keep this world together. Only love and love for each other in any form will keep this world together. And when it comes to why that was important, or why is love, solidarity, of course they're important because they start from your family, the mother, the child, the parents. The family unit is composed essentially and standing because of the love between the members of the family, right? It starts from that point, and then it extends to the extended family, to the mohalla, and then to the city and the country. So it starts from that basic human need and desire to connect, to love, to like, to appreciate, and create a very positive. And of course, we have flaws and we make mistakes and we annoy each other. But those are the things that we have to work upon through love, not anything else. I don't think anything else is going to move and keep this world connected. No amount of politics, no amount of creating borders, new borders, old borders, rejoining borders is going to help anyone achieve what they're wanting to achieve. It's only purely through expressing your love for the other, by building a bridge, appreciating them for who they are, for whatever they might be, rich or poor, dull or stupid, or intellectuals, or economically deprived, or rich. Accept everybody because that's who they are, and that's how we have to build them as part of our larger ecosystem. I think I can't say more than that. So that had to be the theme of the book.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. I mean, love is, what kind of binds us together in a way, and love is also extremely political. It makes the authorities very scared. Who we love is also being policed right now, right? It's also, it's a way of kind of keeping people in check by having this restriction of how we can love and who we love. That was really, really beautiful and powerful in your book. I mean, and I've said so many good things. I don't even know, kind of which is the most favorite part of my book. But I would say that the ending, it's so beautifully written. It's kind of this dreamlike sequence almost. It's vivid. It has so many colors. And it's also beautiful because it engages with the question of return. And I was, wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that. What place does return have in our lives? Not only as a physical kind of return, but is it a moment of reckoning? And it's also about the future, right? Like, where do we go from here? So perhaps you tell us about that.
Sure. I think for those who can return to the places that they love so much that they can't get it out of their systems, returning is an option, of course, and trying to live in those places once again, which they had left, would be a wonderful thing to have. But one needs to be conscious and aware that those places have changed in the meantime, right? So what you might have seen 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 70 years ago, we visited Lahore when I took my wife to visit her grandfather's house in Lahore 3 years ago. And 70 years later, it was not perhaps what she had imagined in her head as her grandfather's house. So to say that, or for me, I went after 24 years to Kashmir. to see that house where we used to live. The place had changed. So to think that you can actually return and live in a place is something that you have to really think very, very carefully about, because you have changed in the meantime as a person in those years, in those generations. To physically go and live in that place would require a lot of effort for you as a person to bring yourself into that space and absorb the new home, as you may want to call it, and then accept it. Because there has to be a lot of exception in that. On the other hand, the mental reconciliation, and I think your home never leaves you. Where you grew up, the memories and those beautiful moments never ever leave you. They shouldn't haunt you. That is what my point is. They should not haunt. We all leave our homes for one reason or the other. We all leave our parents' homes, more and more so in these days. But if it is forced, if it's under difficult conditions, that memory is going to haunt you, and that's not what should happen. What should happen is remembering your home. Even if you live in America and you grew up in Nigeria, you have all the. You should be allowed to remember, your homeland, but it shouldn't be that, oh, I could have lived there if I was not forced out. So I think the mental reconciliation is very important. And to that, I would say a physical return sometimes helps, even if it's temporary, as was in my case, or in many other people who have returned to there. I think let me just bring you back to that example I gave you of my wife, who knew of Lahore, who knew of the stories of that place called Ramnagar in Lahore through her father, through her grandfather. And when she was leaving, I remember she said, I feel I'm leaving something behind. But she also took a lot of pictures and videos of the place. Obviously, she had heard about these things. And a form of closure happens. It gives you a lot of satisfaction that you've been in that place which you had heard about. In my case, I had lived in that place. When I went to Kashmir after 24 years, I think that closure was very important. Every loss requires a closure. And I think by physically being in that space helps a lot. By mentally being in that space also helps, which we all do all the time. But by physically going there, seeing it for yourself, adds a new dimension to your closure. I don't know, Bani, does that answer the question that you originally asked?
I think that's very well put about how return is as much about closure as it is about new beginnings, and it's not necessarily about reappropriation of what once was, because that has also changed, and you have also changed. We've all changed in that time. Places aren't just kind of frozen in time and space. The places change. Um, and I want to kind of end this conversation in a way before we move on to your snippet and take some comments from the audience. I want to ask what the question of return has also become so politicized in India, and with Article 370 and so on. And without really getting into the politics of it, I want to ask you, what do you imagine as the future of Kashmir and of Kashmiris, and where do you see we are heading, or where we should be heading in a way?
I think I would say no divisions, no borders, no politics can change a land. A home will be a home. A culture will remain a culture. And yes, there might be some changes to it. There will be some influences, but that can anyway happen. The borders being drawn or not drawn. I mean, you can't change Baramulla from its position where it is. I mean, it might have belonged to a different, larger entity at some point of time. Now it might belong to another entity. And in the future, who knows, it might belong to yet another entity. That's not going to change the town of Baramulla or its people, right? And who willingly wants to necessarily migrate from one town to the other? It doesn't happen. If it happens naturally, that's fine. I think the future, I can't predict really, but what I would say is no change to the culture, to the language, to a people and their thoughts should be forced, should be thrust upon them. It doesn't have results. It never has had good results in history. They are like invasions. And whenever invasions have happened, they've had terrible results. People have felt very, very discriminated, subjugated, and oppressed in invasions, all sorts of historical invasions. So I think any change which has to happen should happen naturally. If there's any wrongs or evils in a society, that should be tackled slowly, carefully, gradually, with the consensus of the people, never ever done overnight. I can only say we've been to a tier 4 yesterday, suddenly with a few hours of notice. I can see it just depressed everybody over Christmas. So no change, no force should be applied whenever you want things to change. It should be a gradual, thought through, extremely well planned process, which should have the buy-in of the people of a place, of that city. Because if you don't have the buy-in of the people, no change is going to have an effect. It may be on papers, but it will never have any effect. So I would say the consensus, buy-in, and acknowledging that the people of a place, of a land, are very, very crucial. It's not the land, it's the people who are very crucial to the prosperity, to the growth, to the happiness of that land.
Absolutely, Sandeep. And I'm really kind of very struck by the things that you're saying. And I wish that people in higher positions of power were also to kind of listen to the lived experience of displacement and listen to these key words of consensus building of people and not just land, but people and cultures. And anything that one does overnight, which is enforced upon people, is going to result in feelings of alienation, backlash, violence, as we are seeing. I think I will end this conversation with that, but perhaps you'd like to read out another excerpt from your book, and then we can open up to the audience as well.
Okay. This one's also about the theme of borders, because we've been discussing borders. So I think I'll choose this a little closer home now. He was 9 years old then and had learned the names of the states he would see on the journey: Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, Haryana. But he put his head against the window and fell asleep, missing the border between Jammu and Kashmir and Punjab. Chaman had argued with him for 3 hours in Varmul over this. The border will be a long river, deep enough to pull an elephant in. It could also be a stone wall. Rahul had said this as they had pasted stamps in an album. Chaman had cackled. You need tons of money to build a wall around a state. Have you not heard of the Great Wall of China? This is India, you fool, not China. I know geography. You don't even go to a proper school, said Rahul. Do they teach geography in the Kaksha? That was the worst insult he could have hurled at Chaman. Kaksha was a religious Hindu school which Chaman attended on the weekends. Rahul's father frowned upon it, and in turn, so did Rahul. Rahul, you mouse, you know nothing. It took the Maharaja 20 years to build Taj Mahal, just one palace. It would take him hundreds of years, maybe thousands, to build a wall. Chaman's history was as mixed up as his geography. Bet, Rahul had said. Okay, your stamp book. When the train to Delhi stopped, Rahul saw 2 Punjab policemen in colorful turbans. Was that the state border? Just a few policemen with wooden rifles? No trench? Not even a line of stones? He imagined his stamp book in Chaman's large hands with all its new Osterreich stamps and cried. The train had stolen across the state border like a thief.
Thanks, Sandeep. That's really powerful and evocative. And I think also given the context of Majha House and Amritsar, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about borders, and perhaps we can engage with the audience over that as well. I'm just going to take some questions and comments that have been written in the chat box. And my first request would be to Sarabjot to please read out what he has written in on the chat box related to Kashmir, please. Sarabjot, would you like to unmute yourself and read out your comment?
It's a very long comment. Do you want me to read the whole thing?
Yes, why not?
Okay, so I'll do it in Hindi. In fact, it was in Punjabi, the poem. but I will, in any case, I have translated it so that it can reach the larger audience. So it is about Kashmir, and it goes like this. मैं कश्मीर हूँ, मैं कश्मीर हूँ, मैं दबी हुई चीख हूँ, मैं नैनों का नीर हूँ, मैं सीने में संगीन हूँ, गर्दन पे रखी शमशीर हूँ, हाथों में लगी हथकड़ी हूँ, पाँव में पड़ी जंजीर हूँ, मैं गुड़िया चिथड़े चिथड़े हूँ, मैं खिद्दो लीरो लीर हूँ, मैं कश्मीर हूँ। मैं बंदूक से निकली गोली हूँ, कमान से निकला तीर हूँ, खोई हुई तदबीर हूँ, बिगड़ी हुई तकदीर हूँ, इस मुल्क की ऊंची नाक की फूटी हुई नक्सीर हूँ, मैं उजड़ा हुआ सुहाग हूँ, मैं बिछड़ा हुआ वीर हूँ, मैं कश्मीर हूँ। कहीं आजाद, कहीं मकबूजा हूँ, नक्शे पर एक लकीर हूँ, खुसरो की खोई जन्नत की धुंधली सी तस्वीर हूँ, मैं शिवधर भी हूँ, मैं ही मोहम्मद बशीर हूँ, सौतेले माँ बाप की गोद ली, मैं पराई पीर हूँ, मैं कश्मीर हूँ। मैं नाखून में चुभी छिलतर हूँ, अंगूठे पे लगा चीर हूँ, अपनों से शर्मिंदा हूँ, दिल्ली से दिलगीर हूँ, अपने रहबरों से लुटी पिटी, अपने घर में फकीर हूँ, रूह कल्ब से हुई जुदा, अब ठंडा यख शरीर हूँ, मैं कश्मीर हूँ। मैं तीर्थ अमरनाथ हूँ, दरगाहे दस्तगीर हूँ, मैं बम बम भोलेनाथ हूँ, मैं नाराए तकबीर हूँ, जिसे नापाक नजर खा गई मैं वही बेनजीर हूँ, मैं लहू से लिखी जा रही तवारीख की तहरीर हूँ, मैं कश्मीर हूँ। थैंक यू।
Beautiful, Sarjot. Really, as you know, I'm a big fan of everything that you write. So this is really, really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another comment from Sanjoy Hazarika. Would you like to read it out, to unmute yourself and put on your video if you want, or should I read it out?
Bani, please read it out. I don't need to share my face or my voice. This is your story and that of Raina. So let's hear you guys.
Right, okay, I will read it out. So Sanjay asked that is the theme of displacement, migration, refugeehood, victimhood, and persecution, or the lack of acknowledgement of that persecution, are these themes that Sandeep you will explore in your new books? Are you also looking at other forced and voluntary migrations of communities in different parts of India or South Asia? These are issues that have engaged Sanjay Hazarika for years, for decades, as a writer, documentary filmmaker, and researcher.
I do not know what I will write in the next book, but for now, I think a lot of what you asked is already in this book and it's been explored. So I would not want to repeat that. But yes, of course, the world is so big and there are all kinds of migrations and refugees under different circumstances. So when you live in a city like London, you come across practically everybody who has left their home for one reason or the other, economic or social or persecution, or I mean, there are so many stories around you. But yes, I think we should all engage, writers or not, in this dialogue of understanding why people have to leave, why they have to leave, and why do they have to suffer for the rest of their lives with the memories. As I said, they are haunted by those memories. So that has to be tackled. I think by not just me, by I would say anybody and everybody who lives in these big cities and who has left their homelands.
Absolutely, but you do it so well in this book of yours, and I really do encourage everyone to pick up a copy and read it, because I think you do deal with these issues in a very, very fine, sensitive, and empathetic manner. We have another comment from Guru Desh Singh. Who would you like to read it out, or shall I read it out for you?
Thank you. It's not a big question. I think part of it I already heard in the talk, but I guess most of it, what I heard was spoken from the point of view of a migrant Hindu. I would like to know, since the book is about everything, I would like to know something about what Kashmiris think of the alienation and the terrorism and the loss of economic opportunities in their own state.
Yes. It's always easier to write about your own experience. There's no doubt about it, because that's the first thing that you relate to. It takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of effort and a very deep understanding to be in someone else's shoes and know what the other person thinks. And if you have not made a conscious effort as a community to understand what, let's say, as a Kashmiri Pandit community, to understand what the Kashmiri Muslims think or what they've suffered, it's only then half a story, I would always say. I'll let you read the book to understand how much it covered, how much ground it covers of what you just asked. It's hard to be very honest. It's very hard to know what does the person. Now, I'm not saying Kashmiri Muslim necessarily. I'm saying Kashmiri who has not left Kashmir, who's living in Kashmir for the last 30 years, in which I have not. What is he really thinking? I mean, of course, I have friends and I know people who live there. You have to be immersed in an environment. You have to have experienced that force, that oppression, let's say wherever it came from, and have felt it deeply to be able to express it. So for me to be able to express on behalf of a Kashmiri Muslim would be perhaps just touching a very small aspect of their being as an entity, of having lived in Kashmir and those experiences. I have not experienced that. I have left Kashmir in 1990. I have not lived in a city or town where after every 200 meters, I see a soldier with a gun. I experienced that in 10 days of having gone to Kashmir, and it was not a nice experience. That's all I can say now. The people behave pretty much as they used to behave. I did feel that there was, people were not very open like they are in Delhi or elsewhere in the world. So which means there is an element of fear and there's an element of oppression. There was too much army there, and there were too many people with armed people with guns, and that was not a very pleasant scene to look at. Every temple you wanted to enter, there were people. Every mosque, there was gunmen, and every street had, after every 200 meters, you would see somebody with a gun, and that's not a very pleasant thing to see in a civil society, you know. So if I could feel very overwhelmed by that in just 10 days, I cannot begin to imagine what it must be to live like that for 30 years. So I really cannot go beyond that for now. And how somebody feels about what is happened or what is still happening, I can only make some assessment or an assumption. It must not be a nice feeling. It must not be a very comfortable feeling to have something being brought upon you as an entity, as a society, as a community, and you not having any say in it. This is what I said before. Your say, your buy-in into any changes in the government, changes in a democratic setup, and changes in your society, in your language or your culture has to have your consensus. If I was a Kashmiri Muslim living in Kashmir and if I was not included in any of these discussions, I would be very offended, I would be very upset, and I would be perhaps very angry. So, but I'm not there, so I can't say whether those are the actual feelings of people living there, but this is what I say. If I was there, this is what I would also feel.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandeep. I think that's a very, very important perspective from Kashmir and also from somebody who has been through the lived experience of displacement. I think you have a very unique and strong voice about Kashmir, and which comes across very well in your book. And once again, I encourage everyone to engage with your novel. Arundhati Ray, another one of our audience members, says that she will actually buy the book because she's passionate about Kashmir, and there's so much rich material about Kashmir written from perhaps a vantage point of one person, but covering so much ground within that landscape. We have Mitra Phukan also, who thanks you and says that she can relate to these points about identity and migration that you've written about being from Assam. with that, perhaps we can wrap up this conversation. I mean, Sandeep, if you have some last words, I would really invite you to come.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. You have a question. Yes, you can have a question then.
Sorry. Firstly, I just wanted to show the book. It's really beautiful. And I would urge each one of you to go out and buy a copy, order a copy on Amazon right away, because it's got a lot of meat, and a lot of that has been covered in the discussion today. But I really think it's a book worth doing, and it's a book on Kashmir which has come after a long time. And since I have read the book and I've also read your bio, I just had a question from there actually, because it says in your bio, when he lived in Turkey, he was stirred to write about migration, and a novel came to life in England. So, was there a particular incident that made this happen?
Yes, there was an incident, and well, I didn't think much about it when that happened, but I think that went into my book in one form or the other. Would you like me to talk about that quickly?
Yeah, yes. Tell us about that. Yeah.
Okay, so basically, we lived in Turkey in Istanbul for about 3.5 years, and once we took, this was around I think 2001, we went on a coach to Greece along the Aegean Sea, and on the way we stopped in a town called Komotini. Now, Komotini is a seaside small town in Greece, and we didn't really understand why were we stopping there. Why were these coach people wanting to be in Komotini when there were other places to go to? Now, the thing was, the coach, which we realized later, my family realized later, was full of people who had come from Kayseri in Cappadocia, which is in central Turkey. Now, this town, it seems, in 1920s, had a lot of Turkish Christians who had fled from Kayseri in Cappadocia to Komotini in Greece because of the war had ended and there was an exchange between the Greek and the Turkish nations. So these Christians now live in Komotini, and very old people now, and they walked into this cafe where these Turkish Muslims had come from Cappadocia. So it was very well planned, actually. The whole coach was full of people from Cappadocia, and we didn't realize it. So there was a reunion in that cafe. People from, younger people from current Cappadocia, from the town, meeting these very, very old Turkish Christians who had fled from the town in 1920s, and they were reuniting in this cafe, and we were just watching it because my family was the only kind of foreigner in that situation, and we were just watching what's happening here. So they met each other. They seemed to know each other's families. Obviously, they had come from the same town, and they started discussing things, and it continued for a good 2 hours. They had their coffees and teas, and shared a lot of stories. We could gather that they're trying to exchange, and suddenly, they break into songs. Turkish songs, which both the Turkish Muslims and these Turkish Christians who are now living in Greece start singing, and they sang, and the whole restaurant, the cafe, reverberated with the sounds of these very happy, reunited families, and it was a very emotional moment to witness. And I think in my subconscious somewhere it got registered. And when I was writing the book, I think the concept and the thought of reunion between these lost communities or these fractured communities was, I thought, a very beautiful thing to have happened. And I witnessed it, and I thought this should be done more and more in real life wherever these things have happened. And that's how it, sort of that Turkey kind of played into my book when I was writing my book.
Thank you. That really is a lovely story. And being in Amritsar, it sort of resonates with you so much more because we are so close to the border. And also at Majha House, we've started a program called Sanja Punjab, which tries to talk between this Punjab and that Punjab, and try and also diaspora Punjab, and try and talk about culture and literature and music and food and all our inherited histories and our inherited selves, actually. So it really is a beautiful story. Thank you very much. Maybe if there's no other question now, then we ask Jasmeet to please do our formal conclusion.
Do we have another question or shall I?
Bani, I don't think there's anything more, is there? I didn't see anything.
No, not really. There are some comments about.
No, I don't want to take the bus in the cold. Listen. Lambda invoice has come.
Sorry, may I request the audience members to please mute themselves unless they have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Jasmeet.
Okay, and I am so happy to listen to the account that Sandeep and Bani has brought out today. Nostalgia for sure, beautiful memories and a captivating account of your book, the way you came out with it along with Bani's descriptions. And what I gauge from the entire conversation is that you just live in your head. Everybody lives in a small space, which is our head. And of course, the house is, as you mentioned, bricks and mortar. And home is, of course, the environment where you absorb everything which you are part of, your life, growing up, your land, your culture, and Baramulla, we've all visited and we've stayed, we've pitched tents, we've done horses, and year after year, we would all go there with our parents as little siblings and then as grown-ups, and we've seen the frozen rivers, and I mean, nostalgia sets in beautifully. Yes, home is the land, the mountain, the trees, the flowers, the flavors of the food, the cuisines, everything. And it's bound to come back. And talking about Rahul, the way he was forced out of Kashmir, not a deliberate choice. If it's not a deliberate choice to be called a refugee, it's not migration which you take willingly. And memory always, of course, takes you back to Kashmir, like you talk of your Oxford Street and how you meet people and how they talk of nostalgia and also the loneliness that you feel in your head. And you talked of identities, and we also listened to you when you talked of multiple identities, of course, with hyphens. Yes, multiple identities are with all of us. We're living with them today, no doubt about it. But somewhere where it has hurt you, they come out more vividly in your mind. And then when you are dislodged, this question is very, very sharp in your mind. Multiple identities trouble you at times. Very well brought out the way you talk about Muslim Pandits and the Urdu and the Hindi amalgam that you mentioned when a lady addressed her daughter. And of course, the bias comes. Whichever culture you may be, whichever religion you may be following, the bias comes because you've been forced out. And the wrongs keep happening in the society all over the world, like you mentioned, Turkey, and there are so many, and the Germany, the camps you mentioned. You can't do much. Talking about 47, Hamidullah, Mirwaz, whether you talk of 370, whether you talk of infiltration from the neighbors, these are all wrongs of the society. They'll never stop. Maybe not here, maybe somewhere else. At the government level, at the personal level, it's about to happen. History always does that. So you have to ease your mind out of these things to be able to live in a sane manner. And only solution that you are offering is human solution. And that is.
And love, biggest thing.
Love is the highest frequency and it tops the charts.
Yes.
That's the only thing that is going to rule over, well, whether you're with a family or with friends or with acquaintances, or even with people across the border, like you mentioned, your Turkey experience. It overrules our borders and it comes out with bridges. Yes. ऐसा तो होता ही है और होता रहेगा. Gradually nahi hota. These things happen in a very sudden manner. That's the law of the world. So let me wind up by beautiful lines we enjoyed from Sarvjot and from Dr. Gurupdesh, and the account given by Sandeep and Bani, and of course Preeti. I would love to wind up with the lines Gar Firdaus Bar Ruye Zami Hast Hami Astam Hami Astam Hami Astam. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, audience, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep, for a wonderful conversation. And thank you, Majha House, again. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Bye.
Bani, thank you. And thank you to Preeti and to Majha House and to Westland and everybody
And look
else.
forward to your next, of course.
Yes, of course.
And the cover of the book is beautiful.
It really is. It
I
really
love
is.
the cover so much. We'll go through the
Thank
text.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.